All right, thanks for coming. I'm Robert Pia. If you don't know who I am, I'm president of the THS. And we are in Tucson, which is from the O'odham word Jukshawn, which means black base, where the big A on A mountain is. That is Jukshawn. And I work at the Desert Laboratory on Tumamak Hill, which is from the O'odham word Chamamagduag, which means horned lizard mountain. And across the way in the Catalinas, they're known as Babadoag or Toad Mountain. And this is Push Peak, which is the profile of a giant toad. And if you go to the west side of Push Peak, you see a giant toad's back. There are the eyeballs there, parotid gland, and the legs and such. That's why it's called Babadoag. So we have great merch to show you these really cool tote bags that I really like. I think they're $15, Maggie, is that right?
Excuse me?
The totes are 15, 20, all right. And got some cool shirts, one of which I'm wearing as well. I also have a copy of Journal of Herpetology for anyone who wants it. I'll just leave it here.
And Robert?
Yeah.
We have the snake book.
Oh, yes. I'll get to that here shortly. So we have Snakes of Arizona for sale. And these are just some books written by THS members. There's another one on Mojave rattlesnakes that written by Michael Cardwell. Let people in here real quick. So the follow-up to the Snakes of Arizona is going to be these two books. And if you're interested in contributing photos or records, this is a place to go to help in the effort. Paul Mayer is looking for Gila monsters and helpers for a Gila monster study. And this also reminds me that there's a desert tortoise that is in need of a home. So if you or you know anybody who can take in a desert tortoise or a turtle, someone else recently just now found a turtle that needs a home, talk to me or this person here.
I just found a slider on the road on the way here.
Okay.
I guess it's one of the Sonora desert sliders.
Okay.
Get ready to slide across the road.
Okay. What's your name?
Todd.
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 Todd. Thank you for coming. So on September 2 and 3, the Juvenile Fish and Wildlife Society is going to have a BioBlitz. So if you're interested in participating, talk to Matthew Mayer, who's here. And September 30th and October 1st is going to be the Tucson Reptile and Amphibian Show and Sale. And we'll have a table there if you want to help. So we have this research grant, Chuck Lowe Herp Research Fund. And this year we have awarded, clear that up a little bit. We've awarded some really great projects here in the United States as well as in Mexico. And these projects have to do with the herpetofauna of northwestern Mexico and the southwest US. And of course, we have the Sonora Desert Toad Fund, which we started because of this toad's demand from psychedelic. And we awarded some really great projects, really interesting projects, which are orders of magnitude much better than when we offered this grant in 2021. next month, let's see here. Rafael Lara will be speaking next month on ecophysiology. But there's some great projects that I'm really excited about to learn about in the coming months. Okay. And this is the upcoming cover of Sonora and Herpetologist with a great photo by Francesca Harris. And coming up in November will be our elections, and we're looking for officers or people who may want to be a director on the board. If you're interested in being part of any activities at the THS, talk to me and get you connected. All right, so I already told you about September and October. I will talk to you about the Sonora desert toad again, but with some new information. And then November is our last meeting of the year, and we'll have elections. We're going to do the Jarko Conservation Award and have people share one or two of their favorite photographs and why. If you haven't caught any of our or missed a meeting, that is, you can go to our YouTube and watch every one that we've recorded so far. And so tonight is Taggert Butterfield. He's going to talk about obviously one of my favorite species, the spotted box turtle. And so I'm going to hand it over to him.
Hello, everybody. I'll share my screen.
Oh, sorry, Taggert, I muted you.
Thank you.
Taggert, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the talk. And thank you so much for inviting me to Tucson Herpetological Society, which I actually have a special connection to because my advisor during my undergraduate and my master's and a close mentor and friend, Daniel Beck, was actually the first secretary of the Tucson Herpetological Society in 1988. So, you know, maybe you could say that his passion for sharing his curiosity for nature has made it full circle with his student now giving a talk at the society that he helped start. So today we're going to talk about the Sierra box turtle and, you know, a summary of some of the studies I've done and also more specific project that we're doing, trying to understand selection and head size and behavior in male turtles. And this is my first opportunity that someone's given me more than 15 minutes to talk. So if some of the transitions are confusing, you guys are going to learn my mistakes with me. And so hopefully at the end, if there is questions or need for clarification or curiosities, you can ask them. So the Sierra box turtle. Okay. So the Sierra box turtle is the coolest of all box turtles, in my opinion. Definitely a biased opinion. But they're distributed from Sonora to Jalisco, Mexico. And on the right, I put the range map in small at the top right. And they go by several names in Mexico. One of those is the Tortuga de Mochomera. And Mochomeras are leaf cutter ant middens, which we're going to be talking more in detail in several slides about these middens. They're also called Tortuga de Chispas, Tortuga de la Sierra, and Tortuga de Monte. And at the start of the talk, you heard Robert say spotted box turtle. They're also called spotted box turtles in English. I like the Sierra box turtle just because my favorite part about these species is the Sierra and the habitats and the landscapes where they exist in the Sierra. But also I like their spots too. So that's also a good name. So there's two recognized subspecies, Terrapene nelsoni klauberi, which is a northern subspecies, and Terrapene nelsoni. And on the right are some pictures of these, which we'll look at more detail in a few minutes. So the species was first described in 1897, and the credit went to Edward Goldman, who found individuals in Pedro y Pablo, Mesa Pedro y Pablo Nayarit in 1897. And during that same year, a French naturalist, Léon Degout, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, also found a specimen. And based on the date, actually found the first specimen. And, you know, knowing the herpetologist, knowing the herpetologist as I do now, I bet they knew each other, and I bet they both knew they found a turtle, and I bet they went and raced to get the credit for it, or maybe not. Maybe it was just a coincidence that they both found individuals. But that's when it was first discovered. And since then, the taxonomy has been reworked several times, and there's been intermittent natural history observations, but there hadn't been any comprehensive field studies when I came to start working with them. So in 2008, you know, our aim was to start documenting the natural history of Terrapene nelsoni in Sonora, and we've also done surveys in Sinaloa, Nayarit, and Jalisco to look for this species. And what we're going to look at today are the main habitats or ecotones that we found turtles in, the abundance at different elevations, at least in Sonora. And we're going to look in more detail about aspects of their natural history and that we've learned from a 30-hectare plot in southeast Sonora. We'll look at diet, microhabitat use, daily and annual activity patterns, demography, home range size, and head morphology and behavior. So this is just a brief look at sites where we've sampled for this species. Alamos, Sonora is where we're located, and the surrounding areas are the main areas that we've sampled and worked at. But the past 2 years, we've been doing sampling in Sinaloa, Nayarit, and Jalisco to try to find out what's going on with the species and where they occur in different states, in different parts of the range. And the green dots represent places we went and found turtles, and the red dots represent places we went and did surveys and we didn't find turtles. So the general habitats that these turtles occur in represent the western slopes, the habitats that occur on the western slopes of the Sierra Madre Occidental, starting with pine oak forests, which are generally in higher elevations, and oak savanna, which we'll talk about in a second, and also high altitude grasslands and tropical dry forests. So I just have a few pictures here of the examples of the habitats. For example, the pine oak forest in Nayarit, where there's parts of the Sierra that are very flat for many kilometers, and you know, would be perfect places to have an abundant turtle population of turtles to study. But where we work, it's there's a little bit more slope and there's denser understory vegetation, although it still is a very ideal place to study turtles. And then there's oak savanna, and the oak savanna is an interesting habitat that they've been found in, because a lot of times when I talk to a botanist about these, a botanist or other colleagues who know stuff about plants, and I'm asking about these different ecosystems, always ask me if they're not sure it's been deforested and they you know, made it for a cow pasture. But interestingly, unlike the savannas of Africa or South America that are savannas for climate or precipitation patterns, these savannas seem to be savannas for soils, and they're generally very rocky areas where trees don't grow very big and grasses seem to do very well. And, you know, as we'll talk about in a little bit, these turtles like to be around cows, and these are generally places where cows are also found. So they're also ideal habitats for the species. And we've also found them in high altitude grasslands, like these pictures here. And you actually see one of the turtles that we found in this grassland, and I could actually find this turtle because I saw a little path that had smashed down in the grass, and I started following the convoluted path and then found the turtle. And then tropical dry forest, which is hard to take a picture of because their understory tends to be very dense, and they're low elevations, they're much hotter, and there is some interesting aspects about the dry forest that we'll get into a little bit as well. And I just want to show some pictures of individuals from each state. So this is Terrapene nelsoni klauberi from Sonora. And the main difference between these northern subspecies and the southern subspecies is that they're flatter for a given carapace length compared to the southern subspecies that are taller for a given carapace length. And also the males tend to get much darker, like black. Their heads tend to be black or blue, and they have much deeper red eyes. The spots tend to be more abundant and bigger than the southern subspecies. And something else I want to note in this slide, while we have this turtle on the left side that has the very clear annual growth rings, is that one thing that we've learned at our study site in the Sierra in Sonora is that these turtles put on about one ring per year until they're about 20 years old, and then they start eroding away, like this female on the right, in which they've completely disappeared. And this is interesting because turtles that we have found at lower elevations or in the dry forest, in one example, they have these very big annual growth rings, like these Terrapene nelsoni from Sinaloa that were found in tropical dry forest. So, and it seems like these turtles at lower elevations are reaching adult age around 10 years compared to the 20 years at high elevations, which is seen in these growth rings. Although a comprehensive study of these turtles in these habitats would need to confirm this pattern, but so this is the southern subspecies from Sinaloa, and one thing to know is that I don't know if you can tell from the pictures, but they are taller than the northern subspecies for a given height. Here, 1 second. I left a window open. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So you might not be able to tell from the height of these individuals that they're higher, but one thing you can notice that there's less abundant spots. They're paler, and the male in the middle, which is the only male we could measure from this site, has a pale, a more lighter brown, paler head. And if you look at the individuals of nelsoni that we found from Nayarit, from northern Nayarit, you can see in this male that it's more clear that they have a more pale head, and the red in their eyes is much brighter red, and compared to the northern subspecies, that's a deeper red. And also the spots are somewhat less abundant than the northern subspecies, but also finding more in the south, I'm not really sure there's a really clear pattern in spots between the subspecies. And then in southeast Nayarit, in La Sierra de La Yesca, we found one individual, and several individuals have been found since then. And these individuals tend to have a taller shell for their carapace length, like the nelsoni in Sinaloa and Nayarit, but they're very dark. And we only found one individual from this site. And in Jalisco, we found several individuals, and there also seems to be interesting variation here. Turtles, for example, on the bottom are very dark, and but they are still taller for a given carapace length compared to the northern subspecies. And so basically, that's an overview of the places that we found these turtles, the habitats we found in them, and examples of turtles from each site. But the majority of data that we have, ecological data, natural history data, is on those Sonora populations where we've studied more. And our study site Sonora is an ideal place to study these species because we really have a nice example, or almost just like a slice of the Sierra Madre Occidental and the gradient of the different habitats that are found along the slopes. Because as you go to where we live in Alamos, which is around 300 meters above sea level, it's tropical dry forest. But as you keep going to the mountains, you get into the grassy oak savanna and pine oak forest. And one thing that we've been able to do is do surveys at these three different elevations. And something I want you to notice in this graph is that I have some oak trees down here, down in the dry forest, because one characteristic about this gradient is that oak trees are more common at high elevations, but there are certain species that do occur at lower elevations. And one of the first anecdotal observations or reports I got from locals is that oak tree stands have been disappearing at these lower elevations. And our nonprofit a couple years ago started doing surveys of oak trees at lower elevations. And indeed, the stands of oak trees at lower elevations, not only is there more dead individuals, but also there's much more resprouting at the base of the tree and sacrificing of terminal branches, which is an adaptation to drought. And so it does seem like there's this pattern of temperate species disappearing from lower elevations. And what we have found from doing surveys in these different habitats is that turtles are very rare in the dry forests and almost impossible to find. We found a few individuals by luck, but if you out going go looking for these turtles in dry forest, it's basically impossible that you'll find one. And if you go up to pine oak forest or to grassy oak savanna, I'm sorry, turtles are a little bit more common, and turtles are much more common in the pine oak forests. So they seem to be more common at in those temperate climates. And something interesting I was noticing about, or mentioning about those oak tree patches of oak trees that are disappearing at lower elevations. There's also observations in the higher elevations that there's certain species that are starting to establish in those higher elevations. And in fact, we recently saw a rattlesnake at our field site this year, and it's the first time I've ever seen a rattlesnake up at those elevations. And I thought it was a molossus because I thought those would Crotalus molossus, because I thought those were the species that were found at those elevations. But after I showed someone the picture just yesterday, it turned out that it was actually a Crotalus basiliscus, which are more common at low elevations. And recently we also found a beaded lizard up at these elevations, Hyloderma exasperatum. And there's also tree species that are establishing. And down in lower elevations, not only are turtles impossible to find, almost all the individuals we find, with exception of this individual in the middle that was recently brought to us just a couple weeks ago, all the individuals have been very old individuals, and it seems to us like there's no recruitment happening at these lower elevations. However, maybe there is some recruitment happening. We just haven't figured it out yet, because if turtle populations are so sparse, interactions between individuals may only happen every few years, and it just may be a hard thing to understand. But something I want to notice about this turtle in the center, which is recently found in dry forest, is how big the growth rings are. So it does seem that maybe in lower elevations and hotter climates, that turtles with an extended growing season, they can grow to be adults in 10 years instead of 20 years like at higher elevations. But of course, that would require further investigation to understand if that's what's actually happening. So some brief conclusions about these habitats where these turtles occur, the surveys we've done in different parts of Mexico and in Sonora, is that they're found along the slopes of the Sierra Madre Occidental from low to high elevations. And the local density seems to vary greatly, with the highest density of turtles occurring in more temperate climates. And this isn't really a correlation between elevation that exists with specific climate, because in the southern portion of the range, there's mountains that are closer to the ocean, and these ideal climates can occur at lower elevations than they occur in Sonora. And so there's some variation in elevation, but it seems that there's a consistent temperate type climate where these turtles are found. So the rest of tonight's talk is going to focus on the studies that we've done in southeast Sonora. And hopefully, I don't confuse you guys with the data that we've taken from these areas, because each year we've gone to this study site, and there's one plot called the Loma del Frijol plot where we spend a disproportionate amount of time because it's close to the house we stay in, and there's a lot of turtles there. But each year we spent about half time there and then half time looking in other spots, because there's also turtles, good populations in different pockets around our study sites. And so some of the observations we have are in general from that area, and then when we get to the population, the Loma del Frijol, they'll all be from that plot. So we'll first look a little bit at the diet. And so some of the observations of diet we have are from foot surveys, and these include the data from all the turtles that we have found in southeast Sonora. And we've only observed turtles foraging 21 times, or suspected foraging. For example, sometimes, like in this top photo, we'll find a turtle on a leafcutter ant midden, and we assume they're foraging and then we know now, because we put camera traps in front of them, we know they're eating these beetles, but we don't see them actually eating. So it's kind of a rare thing to see. And we've also put radios on males, and we'll explain in a minute why we focused on males. But from those radio telemetry turtles, we've only observed turtles eating 25 times. But so during foot surveys, the foraging items that we've seen them, the number one thing that we found them in during surveys is cow poop. And it's not that they're actually eating the cow poop, but they're looking for these dung beetles that are inside the cow poop. And if you take one of these turtles to the lab, or you have them in a bucket, you put them in water so they can poop, you'll see that they're just full of these green carapaces. And we also found 5 turtles on mochomeras, which are leafcutter ant middens. And what this basically is, so leafcutter ants have very complex colonies where they have different chambers and they harvest fungus and do other unimaginable things. But they have a place in their colony that's dedicated to throwing out the trash. And that trash kind of looks like sawdust. And in the sawdust, there's beetles, these midden beetles. And actually, Robert Villa helped me get the idea for these beetles. And they specialize in these midden, they specialize in eating dead wood in these midden mounds. And we put camera traps in front of these middens, which is just actually, this data would have been of this turtle eating would have been included in the radio telemetry data, not this graph we're looking at now. But we put a camera in front of this turtle, and at the start of the wet season last year and also this year, it sat at this midden for about 2 weeks, just gorging on beetles. As soon as they would present themselves. And if you look at these middens, you can see they're kind of moving around, and there's these beetles underneath, and they wait for that. So the foraging items of the radio track turtles, as I mentioned, we only have 25 observations of 777 observations of turtles. So it's rare to observe turtles foraging. But one thing that's clear is that the three main important food items that they eat are mushrooms, mochomeras, and cow poop. And then 4 times, somehow we wrote that it was foraging, and we didn't write down what it was eating. And there's 3 observations we have of other random items: a beetle and a caterpillar and herbaceous vegetation. And mushrooms are extremely diverse in the site that we work. This is just an example of the mushrooms that I've seen at that field site. And we're not really sure which ones they eat, but they seem to represent an important source of nutrients for the species, and it'd be interesting to know how they're selecting which one to eat. And mochomeras, as I've already described in some detail, these are actually, they're very, every time we find box turtles, whether it's in a dry forest or up in the Sierra, in some area of where we're finding them, there's always a leafcutter ant midden. So it seems to be that this could be an important part of their natural history. But it also seems like horse and cow dung could also be an important part of their natural history. And this leads to the question whether or not if Terrapene evolved to eat dung beetles during the Pleistocene. Because one thing to consider is that turtles are lazy, and they can't fly, they can't climb up trees, they can't run fast, so they love resources that are really easy to get and high energy. So, fruiting trees, the mochomeras where they can just sit and wait for beetles to show up, or these cow dung piles where dung beetles show up, represent ideal food resources, energy resources for turtles. And the ornate box turtle, John Legler did studies with the ornate box turtle, and if anyone has read his book on the natural history of the ornate box turtle, they would know that he compared 2 sites, one called the Dam Farm, where there was a heavy cattle presence, and the natural history preserve that was established by Henry Fitch in the 1940s. And when Legler was doing his studies in the mid-1950s, the natural history preserve already had about 7 or 8 years of being established. And the first thing they did when they made the reserve is they got rid of all the cattle. So you can see in the top photo on the right graph that there's no trees, and it was all pasture area. And after removing the cattle, and after 5 to 8 years of establishing the reserve, John Legler already noted in the book that Henry Fitch had noticed a decline in box turtles since removing the cows. And in 2006, they went back to this reserve to see how it's been doing since they established reserve, and box turtles have been completely extirpated. So as conservationists, as biologists, we often hate cows. They're very conflictive. To us they represent anthropogenic disturbance, and they're smelly, and they move invasive species. But they might represent an important part of the ecosystem that has, led to many of the species like turtles that we know and love that occur there. And so moving on, I don't have much to say about nesting behavior in Terrapene nelsoni. We just barely, for some reason, I just found out last year how to palpate turtles, and I can't believe how easy it is. And I think I've lost like 6 or 7 years of data not knowing how to do it. But this year we started palpating females, and not only did we find out that some females had eggs at the start of the wet season, we found a couple of turtles laying in the evening, at the start of the wet season, and these are some pictures of their nest burrows. And one of these females, we were tracking, and well, we're going to be talking about a radio telemetry study we did that's only males. But this female, I had to put a radio on because she's so pretty, and I had a radio available. So even though the study was for males, I had to put a radio on her because I wanted to know what she did. So moving on to data exclusively from the population of Loma de Frijoles, which is a 30-hectare plot of pine and oak forest with secondary forest patches. And as I mentioned, during our work in Southeast Sonora, we spent time out of this plot, and we collecting data in several sites in the Sierra. But we always spent a disproportional amount of time in this plot because a big interest of mine is understanding population demographics and getting to know individuals and how behavior varies among individuals. And so there's cows present in the plot during the dry season at the start of the wet season, this plot. And in 2018, we started a mark recapture study to understand the population demography of this plot. So 5 years into this sampling, we've made 159 capture events representing 67 different turtles. And based on an open population model estimates, it puts the estimated population about 68 individuals. Although, I'm not a population expert, but basically we've stopped finding new individuals in this plot. So it seems to me like that would represent a close approximation of the population, but there could be a few more individuals there that we're not detecting. And so this estimates there's about 2.3 turtles per hectare. And if looking at the graph, you can see that we've captured 19 turtles once, we've captured 18 turtles twice, 15 turtles 3 times, meaning those 15 turtles we found in 3 different years, 9 turtles 4 times, and 5 turtles 5 times. And so looking at the population structure, females outnumber males, and it's kind of rare to find juveniles. And looking at the structure of the frequency of which individuals different carapace lengths, one thing you can see is that males and females have similar carapace lengths, and we have found 2 males that are exceptionally larger than all the other females, but there's no statistical difference between male and female carapace length. And this is actually a look at all those individuals we found on the Loma de Frijoles plot, all 67 individuals, starting with the females, and then the males, and on the bottom row are the juveniles. And when I started studying this population, I was going from studying a population of Rhinoclemys rubida, of the Mexican spotted wood turtle, which are very social turtles. They're smaller turtles. And something that intrigued me about these turtles is, first, I wouldn't ever find any turtles together. And second, there was a ton of turtles with damage. And if you look at these turtles highlighted, you can see that they have the marginals behind their head chewed up. And then if you look at some of these males, they have these big, nasty, ugly forelimbs. And this one, I didn't have the best picture of these forelimbs, but these forelimbs get really blue and white and puffy. And this year, we have this male that already had forelimbs like this, and he was fighting with this other male for like 3 months. They were in these fights and ended up getting infected with bot flies. And I recently found out that bot flies were a thing in these in Terrapene. So I figure that wasn't the first time that bot flies have happened in turtles. And maybe this individual, actually, it's like one of the only males we found in the Loma de Frijoles plot and we haven't seen again. So maybe he got infected with bot flies and didn't make it, or who knows what happens when they get infected with bot flies. And another thing that intrigued me was that these turtles have ginormous heads, and there's not only quite a bit of variation in female head size, but there's a ton of variation in male head size, especially in this male number 21 that we gave the name Godzilla for having a head that's about 5 millimeters wider than any other male that we've observed. But even if you remove this individual, males still have significantly wider heads than females. And so over the past 3 years, as we change our focus of what we're trying to understand in this population, we've been trying to understand what's driving the selection head size. And why are so many turtles damaged? Are they fighting? And fighting has recently been observed, I think, for the first time documented in the Gulf Coast box turtle by Meck et al. 2021. You can see this picture of a recently bitten turtle, which is actually a younger turtle. Is it the beetles that's driving the variation in head size because they need stronger bite forces to eat more beetles? Is it a sexual ornament? Do females prefer males with bigger heads? Do they use it to force copulate with females or to gain access to more resources? These are the kind of questions we want to answer. However, to be able to answer these questions, you have to return to the basic concepts of Biology 101 and remember that correlation does not always imply causation. And if you want to understand how characters arise in populations, you need to remember that characters vary, they're heritable, and they have fitness consequences. And you need to try to link these different aspects to understand how characters arise in population. And there's three components of fitness. There's survival, how long individuals live, fecundity, how often, how the average clutch size, and reproductive success, or how many individuals they leave during how many offspring they have during their lifetime. So what we've been trying to do in this population on the low molecular cold plot, we've been trying to understand how characters vary among males and if this impacts reproductive success. So the overall question is, does head morphology and behavior impact the reproductive success of male turtles in the Loma de Foucault plot? And the questions that we're going to ask and address today are, first, is head width correlated to behavior of turtles, their aggressive behavior towards other individuals? Is head width or behavior correlated to the number of females within their home range, or how many females they have in their vicinity? And is head width or behavior correlated to food resources in their home range? So to do this, starting in 2021, we equipped 11 to 13 males with radio transmitters and started studying their home range behavior to understand what they're foraging on their home range, how their home ranges relate to other male individuals. And we wanted to measure how their behavior varies when confronted with males or females. And then we've also been drawing blood from all the turtles in the population, and we're using microsatellites to build a pedigree so that we can know the relationships between all the individuals in this plot, so that we can ask if the morphology or the behavior that we're measuring of the individuals is correlated to how many offspring they have in the population. And so today we're going to be presenting the first three aspects of the radiotelemetry study and also the behavior. So to do this, we selected male turtles that range in their age. So starting with the youngest one, number 54 at the top. And these younger ones on the top row, we can kind of age based on the fact that we've observed that turtles put on one ring per year and they start deleting or getting eroded after 20 years. So these tops ones we can kind of confidently age, but as their rings start eroding away, like in this middle row where it's like kind of in the middle of the process of eroding on their plastron or their carapace, we don't really know how old they are. And it's hard to say that with really old adults as well, because how much they erode away could depend on how much they use rock shelters or other things. So the ones on the bottom are the ones that I interpret as being the oldest, especially the bottom right one is definitely in the top category of old, just based on how smooth his plastron is. His entire cell, I'm sorry. So looking at the radiotelemetry data, we've accumulated 770 observations of these turtles, representing 651 relocations. And when estimating the home range of all individuals, we find that they have 1.83 hectare home range, which is shown on the map here. But if we look at the home range sizes and we highlight in yellow the juveniles, we can see that the juveniles have quite larger home ranges, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And if we remove those youngins, the average home range size is about 1.2 hectares. And some other things that we've been able to observe during these radiotelemetry study are we've been able to identify which microhabitats they use when inactive. So they primarily use rock shelters to take refuge. So rocky outcrops and rocks are a prominent feature of their habitat, at least in this habitat where they're relatively abundant. They also use leaf litter and woody debris. And their daily activity, they're basically active starting in the morning and become less active throughout the day. And as you can see through this graph, which represents the proportion of my observations of turtles in each hour of the day, and how many of those observations were composed of a turtle being active. So you can see all my observations of turtles at between 7 and 8 a.m., 100% of those turtles were active. And so this kind of dies off or declines throughout the day. And this is different than we would expect in the southeast with the desert box turtle, which tend to have a bimodal pattern of activity, being active in the early morning, avoiding the midday heat, and then being active in the evening again. And then looking at the activity throughout the year, or asking how many of our observations in each month were comprised of a turtle moving from its previous location. And what we can see is that, you know, July, August, September, October, during the peak of the rainy season, turtles are moving almost every time between observations that we observe them, where there's less activity in February, March, April, May, November. But one interesting thing is that these turtles, compared to terrestrial turtles that I studied in the tropical dry forest around Columbia rubida, move quite a bit during the dry season. And, you know, they don't move that far or that much. But one thing we wanted to do a couple of years ago is put camera traps in front of individuals to understand how long they'll stay in a specific microhabitat. And one thing we learned from the camera traps that actually worked and actually recorded data, because it turned out like half of them, you know, couldn't capture the turtle or just failed. But one thing we found out is that turtles are, you know, almost throughout the entire dry season are coming out to see what the day has to present. You know, they'll come out, they'll turn around and they'll stick their head out, you know, in January and February and March and see what's going on, and then just turn around and go back into their shelter. And that kind of surprised us by putting those camera traps out. But they're most active during the rainy season. So moving on to the behavioral experiment. So one thing that we want to understand, not only does how head variation potentially influences reproductive success, but how behavior could influence reproductive success. And so the past 3 years have basically consisted of me figuring out how we're going to study behavior in these turtles. And I've tried hunting blinds, you know, and I've tried putting turtles in boxes and opening up the box in front of another turtle and presenting turtles that way. But none of those ideas really worked. And so what we ended up doing is doing these experiments where we try to understand how male turtles that we're tracking respond when we present them with a female or a male. So basically what we do is we go track the turtles that we have radios on, and we bring a male or a female that we found in a different part, and we'll present it in front of the male turtle and at 30 centimeters away. And if nothing happens in 4 minutes, we'll move it to 15 centimeters. If nothing happens in 4 minutes, we'll move it to 0 centimeters. And you'll see in this video, I move it to 0 centimeters, and then we start seeing the male turtle engage. And we record the behaviors of the male turtle that we're presenting the turtle to, and also the turtle that we're introducing. We record the behavioral responses during the experiment. And so if we moved it each time and got right in front of the turtle, and nothing happened, we ended the experiment after 15 minutes. But because the goal wasn't to artificially make the turtles mate or to get them into tense fights, we ended the experiment when turtles started mounting, like in this picture. Or we ended the experiment if a male turtle locked in to the other turtle, because these turtles, they don't just bite, they bite and lock in and don't let go. And so if we ever got to that situation where we noticed that the turtle bit and wasn't letting go, we would get in there with pliers, with a screwdriver and pry open the mouth. And so during these behaviors, we recorded these different, during these experiments, we recorded different behaviors: mounting, smelling, retreat walking, and retreat shell. And we calculated behavioral scores, and we gave negative scores to these more passive, non-aggressive behaviors: the mounting, smelling, retreat walking, and retreating inside the shell. And we gave positive scores to pursuing, biting, posturing, which is when turtles, you know, stand up really tall and look, you know, where their enemy is, or maybe not looking for where their enemy is, but you know, there's this clear posturing behavior they do. Or when they locked in bite. And as I mentioned before, if they locked in a bite, that's when we ended the experiment, because we didn't want turtles getting hurt in these experiments. And these turtles, when they lock in a bite like this, so in this picture, they have a locked in bite and they don't draw blood. And it seems like, you know, for turtles to get injured in these fights, it takes, you know, days or weeks. And one thing we have observed is that these turtles, when they do start fighting or they get into skirmishes, two males can be interacting with each other at different intervals for a few months. And so we gave biting a half a score because, as we'll look at, some young individuals, a young individual that didn't have a developed head yet would excessively bite, and he doesn't have the bite force to do anything yet. So, and he was biasing all the data, so that short-term solution I had was lowering the score for biting. And I might learn that there's a better way to do this. So this is a first result of looking at the behavioral scores of each individual when presented with a female in the turquoise and a male in the orange. And we did 105 of these experiments. And before we look at these in more detail, I want to single out those juvenile individuals, because one thing we noticed about the youngest individuals, not only did they have underdeveloped heads, and another thing you can notice is that the scales on their forelimbs are like female scales on the forelimbs are not very burly and mature male forelimbs have very big callousy forelimbs. I'm not sure how to describe it. But basically, these younger males didn't react to males or females we presented them, and they tried running away, and they just didn't want anything to do with the interaction. Whereas this young male, this 18-year-old male, number 42, which is the second from the bottom, seemed to overreact to every single turtle that we introduced to him. And he didn't have a developed head yet, so he would bite. Basically, if we introduced a male to him, he would bite to infinity and not stop. And it didn't inflict any damage, but we would be observing bite for 15 minutes, because a lot of times when we introduce a turtle to these other turtles, they don't want anything to do with the turtle we're introducing them to. So usually we're just kind of mainly observing the behavior of the one we're introducing it to, even though we know both behaviors. And then male number 7, which seems to be just getting into his prime, not only have a fully developed head, he reacts aggressively towards males, and he locks in bites, and he also tries to mount females. So to look at variation among the males, we've been removing these 3 younger individuals, because it seems like these individuals represent males that aren't reproductive yet, although we'll need to corroborate this in the future. But we've removed the analysis for that reason. And we would have liked to do that for old males that we think are extremely old and don't want to fight anymore, but we can't really distinguish how old is old in these turtles, so we couldn't do that. So looking at the behavior of the mature males and remembering that Godzilla number 21 that has that freakishly big head, he also has the highest behavioral score. So that there might be some ontogenetic connection between head size and behavior, at least through understanding this individual. Another interesting patterns of variation that we observed is that there's 2 males, number 32 and 35, that acted exceptionally aggressive towards females. So this variation in the fact that the majority of males acted aggressively towards males, as you can see in the higher orange box plots, and less aggressive towards females, as we can see in these turquoise box plots. This variation in certain males acting aggressive to all individuals and others only acting aggressive towards males and not towards females might be an important part of the variation that determines reproductive success. So hopefully we can disentangle this when we have a pedigree of the population. And so if we return to looking at those home ranges and we remove those younger males that we think that aren't sexually mature yet, we found there's actually very little overlap in home range between the males. And if you look at the details of these home ranges, like first of all, I don't think minimum convex polygon was the best method to understand their core home range area. But some things that we do know about these individuals, for example, this purple one that's sandwiched in between, or a pink purple that's sandwiched between the orange and pink dots, the pink individuals. This male is an older male that estivates up at the top of this hill, and then during the wet season when it starts raining, he comes straight through and seems to pass both of these home ranges and forages down here where there's no other males. And then other areas where there's a lot of overlap, like over here between male number 57 and 14, these males are very old individuals. And another anecdotal observation that I think that may end up being a pattern or maybe not, is it seemed like the alpha males that are in the middle ages and are most aggressive are in the center where there's most resources, And the older males like this 14 and 70, which you can't tell from this image, are in the, the peripheral habitat that doesn't have much understory vegetation. It's mainly pine forest. And you look in the habitat and you wonder where turtles are foraging in there, because there's no, leafcutter ant middens. There's not much understory vegetation. And so I kind of think when turtles start losing their edge, they start getting pushed out to the periphery. So with these data, we can now ask if there's correlation with head width and behavioral score, and we didn't find any correlation when looking at this. Then we can ask if there's a correlation between head width or behavior to the number of females that we found within the home ranges of each male. So we have home ranges of males, and since we've identified almost all the females in the area, we can ask how many females are found within the vicinity of this home range. And it turns out there's no significant correlation between behavior, head width, or how many females are found in the home range. And then we can ask if head width or behavior is correlated to the fact whether or not they have significant pasture areas within the home range. And we also don't find any significant correlation. But if we ask if head width is correlated to whether or not head width or behavior is correlated to whether or not they have a leafcutter ant midden in their home range, we do find a significant relationship, and the turtles that have leaf cutter ant middens in their home range tend to be the more aggressive turtles. So maybe behavior is an important aspect of having certain resources like a leafcutter ant midden in your home range, where which require very little energy to be able to sit out and forage on beetles. So coming back to these mochomeras, they seem like it could be an important part of the natural history of these turtles. And one really cool thing to me is that I'm studying these turtles and finding out that maybe these middens are really important, whereas the locals, when I first went up there, they called it la tortuga de mochomera. They call it the turtle of the leafcutter ant middens. And so they probably could have told me I could have saved thousands of dollars and not done all this studying to figure that out because they already knew it in the first place. So that's pretty cool to find out. So conclusions from this behavioral study are that males seem to reach sexual maturity, at least in the colder climates, around 18 to 20 years. That mature males overlap very little in home range, and the most aggressive males have a mochomera in their home range. And some other notable observations are that certain males are exceptionally aggressive towards females. So to finish this project, we first need to ask if there's correlation between home range and behavioral scores to the number of offspring that males have in the population. And to do this, for the past 2 years, we've been collaborating with Xochitl Quetzal Cortez Rodriguez, who did her PhD with the Cuatro Ciénegas box turtle, Terrapene nelsoni, looking at genetics and population genetics of the species throughout the basin. And we've already genotyped 85% of this lomina fricole population and with 8 microsatellite markers. So we're finishing reading the data. Hopefully this summer we'll have results on that, or at least, maybe we'll get to a dead end, but at least we'll know what we need to do next to find out, to continue asking these questions. And after this project, after we're done tracking these males, it'll be time to switch to females and figure out how females vary in their behavior when choosing males to mate with, because it seems like there's some females that go out of their way to go with certain males. And also one goal that we have is to be able to track females and find their eggs and make sure their eggs hatch, and then take genetic samples from those eggs to figure out which males are actually getting to mate with the females, which would strengthen this understanding of what variation is being favored in box turtles. So general take-home message that might have been confused by the importance of leafcutter middens, well, first is that Sierra box turtles are found along the slopes of the Sierra Madre Occidental. Although one thing, it seems like those populations might be broken up when they get to the transvolcanic belt. And denser populations seem to be associated with cows, at least in our experience. That's what we observed. That's been observed in the ornate box turtle. And yeah, it is confusing. And I observed that more aggressive males are associated with those leafcutter ant middens. And also male behavior is correlated with having a mochomet in the population. So there's a lot of exciting things that we have to move on working forward. And since finishing my PhD, I started a nonprofit with my wife called Estudiantes Conservando la Naturaleza, and we are dedicated to monitoring and conserving the turtle species at a site we work at in Sonora and also Yucatan. And we also have an integral scholarship program associated with this monitoring, which on Saturdays we take out local students to teach them how we sample turtles, and we also do other activities with them. And I want to thank Robert Villa and Tucson Herpetological Society for inviting me to give this talk. And actually, we're starting a monthly newsletter, and this week will actually be our first newsletter. So I encourage everyone to sign up for our newsletters to see, we'll be publishing information each month about what's going on with the monitoring and conservation program, what's going on with the scholarship program, and what we're doing in terms of outreach to grow the awareness of Mexican terrestrial and aquatic turtle species. And there's many people that I need to thank this project. This has been 5 years of work that have taken that I've received help from many different people. And if there's any time for questions, I'm sure, or I'll try to answer them the best I can.
Thanks, Taggert.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a bunch of questions, but I want to give everybody else a chance first. Can you see the chat? Taggert?
Could you say a little bit how the ecology of the species compares to other species of the genus? Well, they seem to occur in temperate climates like other species of the genus. And one thing about nelsoni is there seems to be this important relationship, like has been observed with the ornate box turtle and higher densities being associated with ungulates. And but in terms of ecology of the other species, I'm not sure. The ones in Yucatan and the tropical ones, we also work with Yucatan box turtles. They're very different, just because they live in tropical environments, but they do eat fungus like other box turtles. And yeah, those tropical ones that seem to be quite different, but they seem to closely match what I've seen and observed from populations of Terrapene Carolina in the north, or red of Terrapene Carolina in the north, and also the ornate box turtles in the central plains. Is head width correlated with carapace? No, head width is not correlated to carapace length. Is there a discrete mating season? Well, I think box turtles in general, they'll mate anytime they find a female, but interactions seem to be pretty rare. And so when we were doing those behavioral experiments, most of the males, when we presented the female to them, would try to mount the female, not caring that we were, potentially. I would put a ghillie suit on when I did these experiments, and even though I had the ghillie suit on and I think I was tricking the turtles, I'm sure they knew I was there. But when I put a female in front of them, they didn't care enough about me to try to mount the female. And seasonal variation in male-male fighting, we don't know yet. We've been able to observe a couple instances of male fighting. Like this year, I think there's been 3 instances between 3 pairs where we've actually observed male fighting, because it's just rare that these turtles actually interact. And 2 of these fights have just been very brief fights where we broke them up. We went out and found them, we broke them up, and then we're tracking those turtles and we don't see them fight again. But there's been these 2 turtles, this older turtle and this younger turtle, that in May, before the wet season started, we found fighting. And interesting, there was a female right by when they were fighting. Then we came back in June, those 2 males were still fighting. And then in July, we found them fighting in 2 different occasions. So it seems like they were in this 3-month, and we don't know if it still continued, because what happened at the end of that 3 months, I noticed that the old turtle that we had a radio on hadn't been moving for a couple weeks, and I was like, what's going on with this turtle? So I looked at it, and it had bot flies in its forelimb, and it was full of larvae. And since I'm tracking it, I think I'm pretty tough when it comes to nature doing its natural thing and turtles dying. But I'm tracking this turtle, and I couldn't imagine it just sitting on this hillside and dying from having blot flies. So I picked him out and I brought it to the house to dry up, and I disinfected it. And last week it was pretty much healed, and we released it. So hopefully, he continues living his life without that male coming back into the picture. And yeah, and year round, I think it would occur, during May to October, because outside of those months, turtles aren't really active. So I would attribute it to during the active season, they're probably fighting whenever turtles end up crossing paths.
Dan has his hand up. I'm gonna unmute him so he can, or ask him to unmute.
Great, thanks. Thank you. I'm going to put my video on if I can. Maybe not. Oh, never mind. Great job, Taggert. Good talk. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So a couple questions I have, Tag. So did you kind of alluded to this in your description of head size and juveniles and adults, but did you see any real clear ontogenetic changes in head size of males? So as males grow, do they start with proportionately smaller heads and end up with bigger heads? Or because it looked like in your pictures, some of those youngsters had some pretty big heads. So how does that work? What did you see?
Yeah, so the ontogenetically, and actually in that graph where I compared the box plots of the males and females, I originally had a scatter plot looking at head size and just had highlighted the different sexes, but I thought it was more difficult to observe. But basically, when they start getting it, when you look at that scatter plot, the variation in head size, it gets greater when they start getting into older ages. But I'm not sure how well I can answer it, but it does seem to be ontogenetic that they have smaller heads, and once they start getting to that adult age, there's an average head size of males where it's not extremely big head size, but then those older turtles tend to be the ones that have really big heads.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I
So then
didn't answer very well, but
that makes sense. I mean, that's. And then the other question is, what's going on with the machamoros and with the leafcutter ants and these box turtles? I mean, your data show that they might eat some ants, but I mean, a box turtle eating a lot of ants. I mean,
no, they don't eat the ants. So there's these beetles that specialize.
Beetles, yeah. Okay.
That specialize in eating that like sawdust material that those ants throw out. And Robert has been telling me some complex things about those beetles, that they tend to their larvae and they also eat their feces. And it's like there's these beetles specialized in these middens. And if you sit at one of these middens and look at it for like 10 minutes or so, you'll eventually notice that there's some movement happening under the surface. And if you lift up the dirt, you'll find those black beetles.
Is this a pattern that you see both in places where there are cattle and where there aren't? Because you mentioned that the cow pies attract the beetles as well. Are they substituting the leafcutter ant middens for what they would maybe even do better with from cow pies?
I don't know yet, because I do notice these leafcutter ant middens in all the places that I find box turtles, at least somewhere. But the densest populations seem to be where there's cows.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know yet which one is more important than the other, or maybe it is in this specific plot where there's like 8 different or 8 to 10 different leafcutter ant middens, that it's become this important thing of these males having these middens in that plot. But I don't know, because maybe in a certain plot where there's a ton of cows but there's none of these middens, maybe the dynamic we're seeing with these middens also plays out when there's high density foraging areas of cows.
Cool. I mean, to me, it just suggests how resilient and adaptable these turtles seem to be.
Yeah, and that's some hope I have, because technically in the plot that I'm working in, that 30-hectare plot, there shouldn't be any cows. And, people, put their cows in there without permission. And I think the owners aren't very happy about it. And it is a complicated situation because, as a reserve, having good relationships with your neighbors is a key part of, maintaining the conservation of the area. And eventually I think there's not going to be any cows there. And, I have the hope that, because there's these leafcutter ant middens, that maybe when they remove the cows completely, the population will continue to be like it is, and it won't end up like that natural history preserve in Kansas.
Thank you.
There's a question here from the audience, Taggert.
Yeah, I was wondering, would you say that the presence and density of these leafcutter ant middens are at least partially responsible for some of these behaviors you observed?
Yeah, I would seem to think so. I would seem to think that's possible. And it could be, where there's higher densities of these leafcutter ant middens is where we observe, that these larger head sizes occur and more aggressive turtles and more damage occurs. So I do think that could be a potential possibility.
Okay. There's another question from Tom Van Devender.
Well, a comment, then a couple of questions. Leafcutter ants are all over Sonora. They're throughout the lowland tropics, so they're common. So maybe it's important in this local habitat, but the ants are everywhere. So I'm interested in your comment that your box turtle is more of a temperate animal than Sierra Madre, because we've pulled together about 150 localities of box turtles in Sonora, and Terrapene nelsoni lives throughout the lowland tropical thorn scrub habitat. There's more records from lowland tropical habitats than there are from the mountains. So I think it's a fascinating study that you've done, but I think you need to have a broader perspective for the state of Sonora. So, right.
Well, yeah, I'm not surprised that there's more observations in the dry forest, but I would be interested, finding out where some of those turtles came from, and then going and searching in those areas, because when we find turtles in the dry forest, we put radios on them. So there's 2 places that we had radios on turtles in dry forest in one spot, going on 4 years, and another spot, going on 2 years. And, turtles are so rare, in those dry forest localities, and maybe there is places where they're more abundant. Maybe they need certain, and that one individual that I showed in the center of the screen on the dry forest turtle slide, the one that has those bigger growth rings that I wanted to highlight from Sonora, maybe there, which was, in a different region, was a little bit more north of us, maybe there is pockets where there are more abundant populations of box turtles than dry forest, and they're doing okay. Or like in Sinaloa, where they're only found in the dry forest, maybe in those areas are doing okay. But where we are in the Alamos region, box turtles are extremely rare. And I wouldn't be surprised that there's more observation at low elevation, just because there's been much less work in the Sierra and it's more inaccessible. And so, but I agree that more information needs to be collected in the dry forests.
Let me point out that tropical dry deciduous forest, a tropical dry forest, is only in southernmost Sonora. And that foothills thorn scrub, the thorn scrub vegetation is a transitional tropical vegetation that extends very close to the border to the north. So there's a much larger area of thorn scrub than to tropical dry forest. And the Terrapene nelsoni is throughout the thorn scrub habitat. I don't know about abundances, you're talking about one more common than not, but just distribution points, it's widespread in places like Tepache and, you know, and the Municipio San Pedro de la Cueva and places like that. The animals are seen fairly often.
Yeah.
I have a slightly related question. I remember we were talking a couple months ago. Were you able to look at historical photographs of your region and look at how vegetation may have been changing? Because it seems like there might be a difference between, you know, if you're observing, or are you observing turtles moving up in elevation, or is that just an artifact of detectability in more open vegetation?
Yeah, I couldn't find any historical photographs of Santa Barbara, and you know, I did look in that book quite. I think there is data that we can, you know, compare things to, like in some of those surveys by Gentry and other botanists that came here in the 40s and 80s. There's going to be comments in those. You know, maybe they didn't collect data of abundance of oak trees or different species at low elevations, but maybe they do, you know, talk about an oak stand that they found at 300 meters in 1970 and how many individuals were there. And, you know, I think we would really have to scratch under the surface to find things to compare from that time to now. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Matt has a
This is just a question on the wider range and history of the turtle. How far north do they actually go? Because I know leafcutter ants get all the way to Quito. And I mean, I don't expect the box turtle to be in the desert, but how far north have you seen this species?
I think Robert knows that question better than me. He understands those box turtles in northern Sonora better than I do.
the edge of their range, the northernmost ones are they still at Nayarit? So,
What's that?
or Rito?
No, we got one on Rancho Cherababi, which is basically the same latitude as Arice. But in the records we're putting together right now, we potentially have an overlap of about 30 kilometers with Ornata and Nelsoni. But it's in the Rio Sonora Valley, so way far north. But so
yeah, I'll be interested in knowing, you know, how many turtles that have been found in those low elevations, what, you know, whether they're adults, whether there's juveniles, and when the occurrences happen. You know, yeah, I'm sure everyone in this room knows more about northern Sonora than I do, because I'm always down in that southeastern corner. But I do feel like there is a lot to be known about what's going on in the dry forest, because maybe, you know, at the certain area I am, they're just not very high abundance. And to me, it seems like they're disappearing or they're not recruiting anymore at the low elevations, when in fact, maybe there's specific microhabitats and environments that they do occur in higher abundances.
Oh, yeah, right.
I'm just wondering, since you're familiar with southern Sonora, where is Loma de Frijol in relation to Rancho Santa Barbara?
It's there.
That's its location. Thank you.
Yeah.
it is Santa Barbara.
Second question, that's pine oak woodland. In the pine forest, are those leafcutter ants actually more abundant or less abundant than in the more tropical oak and TDF?
That's a good question. I don't know. I know I don't know how they compare in abundance. Yeah, I have no clue.
One last thing, have you taken any morphometric data besides just the regular measurements? Because it seemed even in all the photographs that you showed, there was a lot of variation in the morphology of the carapace.
Yeah, well, John Ivers is going to be disappointed to know that I didn't measure all the, the gular and the all of those fine, detailed morphological measurements that taxonomists tend to take. I've measured limbs and shell in the turtles, and I've also measured the basic carapace length, plastron length, carapace width, shell height. But all the fine morphological measurements that they use to compare subspecies and the different ratios of the different scutes on the plastron, I haven't measured those.
Cool, well, it doesn't seem like there's any other questions. Oh, there's one more.
But can you tell us how old is old? Any guesses how and compared to other species of terrapene?
But I don't know. I would like to think that some of the turtles are older than anyone that arrived to Santa Barbara, and I tell them that I'm like, this turtle was here before you guys. but I just know that some of those individuals seem old as dirt, and I don't know if it's 80 years or if it's 100 years or if it's 120 years. I just know that, for the entire plastron to be completely smoothed out, even the edges of the marginals, takes a long time. And we know that, at 20 years, they're barely getting to full adult length, and it takes years for this erosion process to occur. So I don't know.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Your activity period's peaking in the middle of the summer rainy season in the tropical deciduous forest. Other things, the activity period is before and after that. But my question is, when are they breeding? When are they laying eggs? And when are the babies hatching? What is the reproductive biology relative to the rainy season?
So when they're breeding, it's hard for us to know. We've only observed one, natural undisturbed observation of a male and a female together. And we think that occurs during the activity period, throughout the activity period. And as I mentioned in the nesting slide, we just barely started noticing that females at least are gravid at the start of the wet season and also laying eggs. But it could be that they also give a second clutch. And we think, or my thinking is, like, so based on where we're seeing these females lay eggs, which is on these very exposed hillsides that eventually are going to be filled up with herbaceous vegetation. I suspect that the hatchlings come out in like October, and they have a month or so to forage before they have to go into the dry season. And maybe being in those open areas that fill up with herbaceous vegetation provide enough forage for them to get through that first season. But we've only found 2 or 3 hatchlings, and it seemed like we found hatchlings that were born late in the year before and not that year. Yeah.
What research have you done on the Jalisco populations?
Well, I've tried helping a student. So we, in the Jalisco population, so we just spent last summer there, and one of the populations we want to keep studying. And there's a student who's finishing his master's who'd like to do his PhD on studying their natural history. And hopefully that will happen. But if not, I need a couple of projects to end before I can get there, because this next 2 years we're doing surveys for the Yucatan box turtle throughout the peninsula, and I'm not going to be able to have time up in the Sierra.
One last question in the chat. Does the Nelson holotype and species description indicate large head width relative to other terrapenes?
Oh, I didn't notice that. but I didn't notice that in the description. But I did notice that compared to other terrapenes, they tend to vary more in head color than head size, and that's one additional opportunity we have nelsoni, because one characteristic about terrapene in general is that the males have a really extravagant head variation, whether it's the Gulf Coast box turtles, the Mexican box turtles in Tamaulipas, which just have insane head variation, orange, blue, white, crazy looking heads, and the Yucatan box turtles. And it's harder to quantify color than it is to measure the width of a head and try to understand what's going on. So, you know, maybe with these studies with nelsoni, we'll start understanding more why there's this amazing variation in terrapene head size.
Well, thanks, Taggert. It was a really good talk, and we had a lot of good questions. And hopefully next year you can update us or talk about some of your other projects.
Yeah, and hopefully I can do it in person. So I live in southern Sonora, and I could take a bus up there, but this week I had to be down here in Jalisco. We're trying to conserve a turtle here in Jalisco, which is critically endangered. So I've been back and forth, but you know, I would love to be there in person.
All right, have a good night.
You too. Bye, everybody.